Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. The Buddhist teaching was, from the beginning to the end, entirely meant to be practical, to serve a purpose of liberating sentient beings. It wasn't ever intended to be a complete philosophical description of reality, but rather a praxis, a way of becoming liberated. The Buddha at one point told his disciples that what he taught was a handful of leaves compared to the leaves in the forest. What he could have taught, but which was of no practical value. In this regard, there's a list that occurs in a couple of places in the Majjhima Nikaya of 10 avyakata dhammas, that is, matters that are indeterminate or undeclared, things that the Buddha refused to definitively answer, questions the Buddha refused to definitively answer. The list is the world finite? World being loco in Pali, which could mean either, it's a rather vague term actually, it could mean the world or it could mean the universe. But I think in this context it means the universe. Is the world finite? Is the world infinite? Or boundless and unboundless? Be a more literal translation. Is the world eternal? Is the world not eternal? Is the self the same as the body? Are the body and the self two separate things? Does the Tathagata exist after death? Does the Tathagata not exist after death? Does the Tathagata both exist and not exist after death? Or does the Tathagata neither exist nor not exist after death? So this is a set of 10 questions. There's a Mahayana version that goes up to 14 questions, but it's expanded by adding the both and neither terms to the questions about the world. So it's essentially the same list. And his reasons for not answering these specific questions vary somewhat. In the first sutta, where he's speaking to a monk, Malankya-Putta, who had challenged the Buddha and said, if you can't answer these questions definitively, I'm going to disrobe and leave the holy life. And if you don't know the answer, just say so. So it's kind of a cheeky guy to speak that way to the Buddha. And the Buddha answered him first with a simile of the poisoned arrow, the famous simile. He said, if a man is shot with a poisoned arrow and a surgeon came to remove the arrow, and he said, wait, good sir, I don't want you to take the arrow out until you can tell me, was the man who shot the arrow, was he tall or short? Was he a Kshatriya or a Brahmin or a Vesa or a Sudha? Was the bow that shot me a longbow or a crossbow? Was the shaft of the arrow made of oak or pine or some other kind of wood? What kind of bird did the feathers come from? And so on. And the Buddha said if the man waited to get the answers to all these questions, he'd be dead from the poison. None of these questions matter. The matter of getting the poisoned arrow out is urgent. No time for such speculation. And this metaphor is for our situation in samsara. We're caught in the round of births and deaths, and the essential business is to make an end of it, not to figure out every last detail. So the questions about the world are basically unknown and unknowable. No one can find the answer to that. There's another list of 4 questions that pondering them will only lead to frustration and possibly madness. And those are the range of a Buddha, the range of a person in jhana, the specific workings of karma, and the nature of the world, which the commentary specifies by nature of the world, it particularly means the origin of the world. So the Buddha wouldn't rule on whether the world was without beginning, without end, that is infinite or finite in time, or boundless or bounded, that is finite or infinite in space. And this plain statement of the Buddha, and when he even said that contemplating it could drive you mad, that didn't stop later generations from contemplating it. And it became very much established in the tradition later that the cosmos is indeed infinite, both in space and time. But this is clearly not something that was stated by the Buddha. Although it has to be said that it does follow logically from first principles. If you take the principle of the dependent origination seriously, that everything arises from a cause and not otherwise, then there cannot be any first cause, because then there would be one uncaused occurrence in the universe, and it would violate that axiom. But in any case, speculation about such matters is ultimately fruitless, and there's no way anyone can know or could possibly know the extent of the universe, either in time or in space. Even in modern times, we have cosmological theories based on observations with advanced instruments, but no one is certain about anything in these ultimate matters, size or the extent in time of the universe. Then there are the 2 questions about the self and the body. And in Pali it's jiva, it's not atta, it's jiva, and kaya. And the reason for not answering this is because it's based on a false premise that there is such a thing as a self. And if one takes the position that the self and the body are the same, then that's a version of materialism or annihilationism. And if one takes the position that the self and the body are different, that's a version of eternalism, or the idea of an everlasting soul. So both of these positions are untenable. And for the Buddha to answer one or the other definitively would commit him to that camp or that range of views. And it seems like these 10 questions, including these 2, they were not an arbitrary list just made up by Malayanka. It seems like the implication is they were a sort of questionnaire that ascetics and philosophers of the time were expected to answer to establish their position on things. And the 4 questions about the nature of the Tathagata after death are really questions about the unconditioned, or nibbana. The Tathagata is a Pali word that contains within it a kind of a play on words, because it could mean either thus come or thus gone, depending how you break up the compound, and it seems to be deliberate. The Buddha is the one who's thus gone or thus come. And in the Pali text, the word Tathagata is used in two related but slightly different ways. One is that when the Buddha refers to himself in the first person, he always says the Tathagata. When other people address him, they usually call him Bhagawa. It's kind of a curiosity that he's almost never called Buddha in the text, but that somehow has gotten fixed as the modern designation. The word Buddha is used more often not as a title or a proper noun specific to Gautama, but as a class of beings. Those who are fully enlightened by themselves are Buddhas. But in any case, the Tathagata is also used in a more general sense to mean the enlightened being. Or outside of Buddhism, it would be like the essence of an enlightened being. So Tathagata, does the Tathagata exist after death or not, or both or neither, is a question about the nature of Nibbana. Because when a Buddha dies, although we don't properly use the word death for a Buddha because it's not the same as death for an ordinary person. It's not followed by rebirth into one of the realms of existence. It's a stepping outside of the cycle. It's called parinibbana, because having realized nibbana with his mind already, he still had the encumbrance of physical form, and the khandhas had not dissolved until the moment of death. And because there's no desire and there's no karma outstanding, he's not reborn anywhere. He cannot be reborn anywhere. So then the question arises to those who are not Buddhas, well, what happens to a Buddha after death? The Buddha's answer to this is no answer, because it's essentially unanswerable. And the specific framing of this question, does the Tathagata exist? Does it not exist? Does he both exist and not exist, or neither exist nor not exist, is a formula taken from Indian formal logic, which did not use a binary logic like in the West, where you have either A or not A and the law of excluded middle. The Indian logic allowed for more subtlety. It allowed for either A, not A, both A and not A, neither A nor not A. So it was a tetralemma rather than a dilemma. So again, this is referring to something that preceded the Buddha, a system of thought, and the Buddha was quite adamant in saying, no, these do not fit the case. And this comes even more clearly in the second sutta, where he's talking to a wanderer called Vacchagotta. And Vacchagotta is completely baffled by this, because to his mind, you had to take one of the four positions. And if you're speaking strictly logically, yes, he's correct. But the Buddha is saying, well, it's nothing to do with logic. You can't pin it down to any of the logical categories. It's outside of all of that. It's nothing to do with that. And he gave the metaphor of the fire. They were sitting beside a fire, and he said, when this fire goes out, where does it go? If someone asked, does it go to the north, the east, the west, or the south? What could you say? Well, I could say none of these make any sense. So it is with Nibbana, none of these four positions makes any sense. So speculation about Nibbana is quite pointless, and anything positive that one wishes to postulate about Nibbana is always going to be wrong. So these four are unanswered by the Buddha because they are unanswerable. They literally cannot be put into speech. You cannot describe within the boundaries of speech the nature of the unconditioned, because words themselves and ideas and thoughts are all conditioned. They're all part of the conditioned realm. So in the teachings of the Buddha, by looking at these questions, we could say there are some things that are pointless to speculate on, that do not lead to liberation, and one could spend lifetimes trying to solve questions like the extent of the universe. There are questions that are unanswered because they're misleading, and they're kind of a logical trap, like the soul and the body. Committing to one or other of those positions would commit one to the self view. And there's those questions about nibbana, which are utterly unanswerable just on their nature. They're impossible of formulating in words. This is also made clear in the formula given in the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth, which is the truth of suffering, or dukkha, is the expression of samsara. It's the shortest expression, the definition of the conditioned world is just to call it dukkha. And the Buddha said that with each of the four truths, he gave a task or an admonition. This is what you should do about it. And for the first truth, he said, this is to be known. He used the polygenati, which means to know, to grasp with the mind, to understand. So the conditioned world is understandable. It can be grasped, the essentials of dukkha, anicca, anatta, dependent origination. These things can be understood with the mind. The third noble truth is the truth of the unconditioned, is the ending of dukkha. And for the third noble truth, he used a quite different verb, patisamvedi, which could also be translated to know, but it's an entirely different form of knowing. It's a penetration by experience. It's not a grasping from the outside and understanding. It's nothing to do with the understanding aspects of the mind, but the simple knowing of direct experience. And this is the only way to know nibbana, is by direct experience. And all the rest of the Buddha's teachings follow this basic pattern, that the teachings are all directed towards leading beings out of suffering, out of the realm of Mara, out of birth and death. And even when the Buddha speaks about, as he does on occasion, he spoke about matters that we could call cosmological, such as the Sata Surya Sutta in Anguttara, where he talks about the end of the world when the 7 suns arise in the sky. And the commentary to that stretches it out into quite an elaborate system. But the Buddha's point, clearly made in the sutta, is a teaching on impermanence. Because he begins by taking that which to the ancient Indian mind would be seen as the most permanent thing, the very emblem of permanence and stability, Mount Sunaru. There were proverbial sayings about, something that was absolutely solid and unbreakable and eternal would be compared to Sunaru. The Buddha said, even mighty Sunaru will one day be reduced to ash. Because he doesn't want his followers to hold on to anything whatsoever as being permanent. This law of anicca, or impermanence, applies to the entirety of conditioned reality. And after the Buddha's time, we get such teachings as the Abhidhamma, which makes an attempt to describe in very minute detail the workings of the mind and of the world, actually, although the focus is mostly on the mind. And this, too, is a description of reality that is focused on liberation. It's a way of understanding the workings of the mind and body as a aid to deep meditation and the letting go. Because by understanding these aspects of samsara is how we release from it. This is the process of vipassana, is to examine very minutely and sharply the occurrences that go on in the mind, to see them clearly. Ordinarily, we don't see anything clearly. We see things through lenses, distorted lenses made up of our fears and our desires. And we don't look at reality face on in this way. What is the actual nature of this occurrence right now? Without reference to whether it's good for me or bad for me, whether it's painful or pleasant, but just its own nature in and of itself. And when objects are seen in that way, eventually the most salient characteristics are the three characteristics of dukkha, anicca, anatta. And when that is seen clearly, without grasping, without self-interest, without either fear or desire, then it's possible to disengage from them. This is the process of first seeing reality in its own nature, yata bhuta nanadasana, followed by nibbida, disenchantment. When the enchantment of the illusion of samsara wanes, then it's possible for viraga, which is the waning of desire, the passion that keeps the whole wheel turning. That's the second noble truth, the truth of tanha. And that allows for vimutti, or liberation, which is the point of the whole exercise. So there is a limit to what we can know, and there's a practical limit as to what it is useful for us to know. There's a lot of material in Buddhism, going on after the Buddha's time, and all the commentaries and the Abhidhamma and all the writers since, that's fascinating and intriguing in its own right. I mean, I should, confess my own tendencies this way, as I wrote a whole big thick book on Buddhist cosmology, but I tried to keep in my mind, and I hope I put it through in the pages of the book, that the whole aim is to make an end. There's a story that I come across when I was researching that book about a Japanese in the 19th century, when Western science was starting to make inroads in Asia. It caused a brief, we could call it a crisis of faith in Buddhist countries. It wasn't as unsettling as some of the scientific impact on Christianity, but it did disturb people a little, shake them up a little bit, because up to that point, I think all the Buddhists everywhere took the Shinryu-based model of the world as literal reality. And of course, it doesn't stand up to observational astronomy at all. And there's a story about a Japanese man who wrote a book attempting to explain the observational facts that were accumulated by modern techniques and measurements and calculations, and reconcile them to a Shinryu-based system, which must have been some real clever handiwork to make that work. And when he finished the book after some years of effort, with some pride, he took it to his Zen teacher and showed it to him, and the Zen teacher kind of flipped through it until he got the gist of what the guy was trying to do. And he threw it back at him and said, "You blockhead. The whole point is to make an end of samsara, not to save it." So really, we should, if we're serious about our practice, we should always keep this in our mind, that what the point of it is, what the goal of it is, which is to make an end of suffering. It's not to figure out every last little detail. And this is something also that on another sort of scale, on a less macroscopic scale, is a big hindrance for a lot of Western meditators, I think, is that, and this has been pointed out, I'm not original with this, that a lot of Westerners don't practice Vipassana meditation at all, but they practice self-psychoanalysis. So they become overly interested in the particular details of their own brand of suffering, their own particular idiosyncratic expression of that universal truth. Whereas really, the only value for meditation that your life history has is that it's the only example you've got to work with in detail, but it's not important. Samsara is not a personal problem. Samsara is the conditionality of the world. It's dukkha, anicca, anatta, and the effort should always be to look for those universal, fundamental realities, not the particular expression of them. Although that can be an entrance for you into the universal, you start with the particular and work towards the universal, which is kind of what the Buddha did the night in which he attained Buddhahood, because it's described in one account in the Vinaya. The account of the Buddha's enlightenment is given as the arising of three knowledges, the T-Vidya, which is also again a play on words, because the Vedas of the Brahmins, there were later four, but they were originally three, the T-Vidya, and Vidya means the same thing as Veda. But the Buddha penetrated these three knowledges, and the first one was the individual or the particular. He penetrated with his mind all his past lives, going back many kappas of time. So he understood his own personal journey through samsara in an unbelievable richness of depth that we can't approach. And trying to imagine it is, violating that. Trying to think about the range of a Buddha's mind would just drive you mad. But he first did that complete understanding of his own karma. Then in the second watch of the night, he had the second knowledge, which was taking that particular journey and universalizing it and seeing the universal laws underneath it and understanding how beings in general rise and fall according to their karma. And then in the third watch of the night, he took it to transcendence when he made an end of the asavas, the root defilements. So his being was utterly purified. So on a much deeper, more profound scale, this is what we're doing when we make progress in meditation. We're going from our particular experience to uncover universal laws. And this allows us some detachment and allows us to abandon them. And that abandonment of samsaric becoming is what leads to transcendence.